Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Sorry for the delay between videos, wasn't feeling the best for a while, but I'm back to full health now, so let's get back to talking about the GOAT format Banlist. So last time we covered the first part of the Forbidden Limited list for GOAT, talking about the cards removed from the game for being too unfun, too game warping and just unhealthy in general. And in my view, Konami did an excellent job with these bannings, taking out most of the FTK enablers and unfun design mistakes they missed on the first list. However, as I said last time, not all cards that cause problems need bannings. Sometimes a card being too powerful isn't just due to the individual card, but as a result of how often a card is seen in a game. As a card like you only see once or twice is not that bad, but seeing the same powerful effect 3+ times a game can often shift the meta to revolve around that kind of card, thus it needs to go to 1 to increase the variety of cards playable in the meta. In addition to this, don't forget this is the first limited list after Konami's first attempt at banning cards, and with their attempts at being so laser focused on killing the Yatterlock, some of their other hits seemed a bit of an afterthought, or at the very least they may have felt they were unnecessary after Yatta bit the dust. We also have quite an extended semi-limited list to go over, as well as one unbanning to talk about, and surprisingly, unlike today, the semi-limited list isn't just cards that could go to 1 or 3, but actually cards that had a reason to be put at 2, be it tweaking certain combos, or just a Runic Fountain style hit, aka Konami telling players, no, you will play the correct amount of cards, so help us God. There's a lot to talk about here, so let's begin with the limited list, starting off with we went off to a good start, as coming in first we got Secret Freaks of Nethys, a card that honestly I got no idea why it's even here. A fire-winged beast, this card in many ways can be seen as a power-crept vampire lord, as it also summons itself back from the graveyard the turn after it's destroyed by card effect. However, in addition to this, it also brings a nasty surprise, as upon being summoned it heavy storms the field. This effect was so good in fact this card saw play almost 10 years later in Fire King side decks. Add on its massive body that only BLS, DMOC and Hades could beat over, and this card's limit seems quite reasonable. So why do I think this card being at 1 was unjustified? Well, now everything I said about this card is true. It's a huge hard to beat of a monster that heavily discourages opponents from moving it outside of battle, meaning in GOAT format the monsters I just listed beating it in battle, or BLS and Chaos Dog banishing it, are really the only ways of permanently getting rid of this giant chicken. So why do I think this card isn't worth the limit? 2 words, 8 stars. Yeah, the biggest problem with Secret Phoenix, and why no deck other than Monarch and a few fringe GOAT decks ever played it, is that anything that can't easily be special summoned and cost more than 1 tribute is borderline unplayable in GOAT due to both the amount of removal played in the format, making 2 tributes hard to keep on the field, and the fact that there are so many cards of equal or stronger power that can either be special summoned or cost only 1 tribute. This meant that only Monarch, a deck playing Soul Exchange and Brain Control, has any hope of summoning this card normally. If you're using one of those cards to either steal or just tribute your opponent's monster, you need this card a 1 tribute on your end. Now I know what you're thinking, doesn't the Hand of Nethys exist to cheat this card out easily, making it more splashable than I'm letting on here? Well yes, that is true and the reason some GOAT decks ran the pair, but the problem is for most other decks, splashing these 2 fire cards weakens the Chaos package, so this potential heavy storm on legs never really saw that much play. Also on top of all that, let's say more decks wanted to play this card. Would any of them play it in more than 1 copy, considering without hand, this card is the mother of all bricks? Also, with anti-graveyard cards not being that common at this point in the game, it's likely that once 1 copy was in rotation, you have no use for a second one. So overall, I think Konami's limit here is actually them not giving themselves enough credit. Basically, I believe this limit was them looking at a card with a built-in heavy storm effect, panicking, and forgetting that unlike Storm, this card actually has balancing downsides. Welcome back, old friend. Yeah, it didn't take long after the fall of Chaos for Konami to realise that without Yatagarasu, there really was no need to keep good old Sangan here locked up. Now while Witch of the Black Forest remained banned for a long time due to the far larger card pool it could search, in particular the Monarchs, Summon Skull, Vampire Lord and others, Sangan had a lot of powerful cards it could search, but nothing that could really break the game or put you so far ahead it was difficult for the opponent to make a comeback. If anything, I'd argue cards like this and Rota are a massive positive for GOAT, as it makes games more skillful and less luck based, as you aren't just hoping to draw one of the cards you want, you can just search it. It also helped make tribute monsters more viable in a meta dominated by smaller monsters and big push summons, as even if your tribute was destroyed, you still got some value from it with Sangan's effect. Overall, in my opinion, a fine addition to GOAT format. Honestly, this is one of the few cases in Yu-Gi-Oh history where a card has been banned and then unbanned between lists, and both changes were completely justified. In the pre-Banlist format, this card was one of the best cards to play, as in the right circumstances, you can win the game by searching Yat off the CED board wipe. Without this broken interaction, however, this card is still very powerful, but not game-breaking, with its best uses being to find removal like Exile Force and Warrior Lady, or cards like Morphing Jar to refill your hand, and Gravekeeper's Spy for stalling purposes, all of which is perfectly healthy in GOAT format. So yeah, great limit in my opinion, that's made GOAT a lot better for its existence. Up next we have, in my opinion, the perfect example of a card for the time that deserved a limitation in DD Warrior Lady. A light warrior, DD Warrior Lady may very well be the best non-chaos light monster in GOAT, and the best normal summon in 3 of its top decks. This is because this card is the single strongest piece of targeted removal in GOAT, as when it battles any monster it can banish both itself and that monster from the game, thus making this card the only good banish-based removal other than its bigger counterpart in this era of Yu-Gi-Oh, as Dark Core being a normal spell with a discard made just plain worse than trap alternatives like Wing Blast and Regeki Break, and Kamacut was printed just short of this GOAT format deadline in Semantic Revolution. You see, not only was this card the best way to outmost boss monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh, from Vampire Lord on release, to Jinzo, to eventually bigger fish like CED, BLS, Sork and the Monarchs, but it doubled as arguably the best piece of Graveyard Disruption coming out several years for DD Crow or the good Banish Floodgates. This meant not only could this card get rid of boss monsters, but in some cases it could prevent them from even hitting the board, by for example banishing light monsters before they hit the yard to strand chaos cards in hand, or removing cards like Sacred Phoenix and Nethys, and of course it could also stop effects like Sangan from triggering as they never hit the graveyard in the first place, making this card a good option both for control decks to remove aggro's big threats, but also in aggro decks to prevent control decks from gaining back resources with floaters and graveyard recursion. In fact, this, along with the rest of the Warrior engine of Exile, Force and Rotor, have helped many aggressive non-light and dark aggro decks see play in GOAT by the number of outs they have to threats that they have trouble with, like giving Beast Down an easy out to Spy, or Earth aggro both an out to BLS and Sork, as well as an Earth in Exile Force they can immediately banish for Gigantes, giving the deck easy access to a heavy Storm-like effect. And all this before mentioning Warrior Toolbox, arguably the best or second best deck in GOAT, which simply attempts to win quickly using all the biggest and best Warrior cards possible, and Liddy is one of the many powerful removal pieces it runs, alongside Mystic Swordsman Level 2, Blade Knight and Grandmaster Suzuki. So yeah, as you can see, DD Warrior Lady and her ilk have done an excellent job at diversifying the meta from a one-deck chaos format and making aggro stronger, but the limit I think was still a very good thing. You see, with this being at 1 and Rotor being at 2, it meant that this card was a one card out to problematic monster threats that's both easy to access yet in most circumstances a one and done deal, which I think is really good, as this card will give both players one-time get-out-of-jail-free cards to a problem without games devolving into who drew more Warrior Ladies. If the point of the limited list is to keep cards in check that are not strong enough or game warping enough for the ban list, I'd say this limit here is a perfect example of this in action. Like I said, if this card had been at 3, I genuinely believe it would have either warped or at the very least defined the meta, as every deck would have had to summon 3 of this card, and it would have nullified a lot of the best threats in GOAT that define the format. It would have also like ushered in an era where Warrior was one of the best decks in the game, with the other decks that would be viable with the decks that could play the most Warrior engine, so likely aggressive decks and maybe some GOAT control lists. So essentially, putting this card to 1 helps keep top decks in check, while also giving rogue decks a great way to compete while not sacrificing their unique game plan. A pretty good limit then, if you ask me. No, 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 why? Why did they bring this cancer back into the game? You must have the perfect format, Konami, free for the most part from all the toxic, badly designed cards from the early sets. A format where back and forth resource-based gameplay was the norm, and dull combo was being pushed to the fringe in the actual format, and it's just meant out of in the modern version of the format. Why would you bring back a card that not only discourages this fun gameplay, but actually makes games faster and more one-sided? You know, the two main things players hate about Yu-Gi-Oh! Nowadays, hence Ghost Resurgence in the first place. For those who don't know, this card, for the cost of 1,000 life points, forces a player to both discard a card at random and then a card of their choice. So turn 1, this card may as well be game over a lot of the time, starting out at 4 cards to your opponent's 6. An era built on resource management, when Trap Dust Shooters at 3 as well, by the way, is a massive hill to overcome. In addition to this, while this card does get weaker over time as hands naturally deplete in mid to late games, this thing still packs a punch, as shredding an already small hand essentially guarantees that an opponent who is behind won't be making any kind of comebacks at all. Now yes, this card was played in formats dominated by Chaos, a side that wanted cards in their graveyard, and yes, Scissor Serpent was played a lot to counter this card, but I'd argue this doesn't make this card more balanced. True, you could get really unlucky and set up an opposing Chaos monster early, but it's just as possible you discard their Chaos monsters themselves, and then their deck is severely weakened, unless they've got a card like Monster Reincarnation. Also, yes, Serpent does make this card a lot less powerful, but doesn't the fact you need to play a card whose main purpose was to counter this one card kind of prove the point that this card is game warping? Now this card is part of the infamous GOAT Trinity, aka 3 spell cards that grant humongous tempo swings in GOAT, by then giving you a bunch of cards, or in this case, discarding a bunch of cards from your opponent, that are mandatory in pretty much every non-FTK GOAT deck. And what's crazy is that Duo, in my opinion, is the weakest of these 3, as it does become less valuable mid and late game compared to draw spells, that are good no matter when they are used. Yes, this card is the worst of these 3 spells, and it still warps the game to the point where you need to actively build your deck to go against it. Why did this card have to come back? Do I mean to dignify this with a response? I generally challenge anyone to give me any good reason for this card to be legal. At worst, this card clogs late game and gives the opponent an early BLS or soak, but at best, it ends the game turn 2 or 3, essentially, by pushing one player so far ahead it's almost impossible to catch up. It also by itself can put a player into a winning position early and mid-game, and force players to make their decks worse just to counter it. Add on Magician of Faith to recycle this monster of a card, and it becomes one of the most toxic things in GOAT. This card was banned again the very next list, and thank God for that. And Konami never unbanned any hand attack card ever. Oh, son of a... Now, if you're expecting me to have a similar meltdown at this member of the Trinity being unbanned, like I did Duo, well, sorry to disappoint you all, but I love Graze for Charity. In fact, it's one of my all-time favourite cards. I love the art, I love digging through my deck, and I love feeling my graveyard. However, I'll do my best to put my bias aside here and look at this card as fairly as possible. So on the plus side, like Pot of Greed, this card does a good job at removing variance from games, but letting you see more cards. In addition to this card also allows graveyard setup, but it's not actually a plus. By pitching 2 cards and activating it, you lose 3 cards in itself from the 2 discards. In addition to this, as only control decks play GOAT's main spell recursion cards, usually this card and the rest of the Trinity give them a way of competing with aggressive decks, which in theory makes GOAT a more diverse meta. Also, this card can help rogue decks search for more answers to meta. For example, Earth Aggro can use this card to both dig for answers like Exile Force for the Chaos bosses, and set up an early Gigantes versus back row heavy decks like Burn, and the Fiend deck I'll be shoving soon on this channel can use this card to fuel an early Dark Necrofear. Okay, I'm just stalling here, this card is busted. It doesn't let you draw more cards than you lose, but that graveyard setup can often still make this card stronger than even Pot of Greed, as the card often may as well just say draw 3 cards, discard 2, then summon a Chaos monster. Yes, this card did give non-Chaos decks more ways to dig for an answer for the Chaos bosses, but it also made turbing outside bosses super easy. So in actuality, this card in some ways shrinks the amount of viable decks to most of those that can play BLS like Chaos decks and Warrior decks splashing enough lights and darks for a BLS splash. Also, yes, this card along with Pot of Greed does make control more viable thanks to Magician of Faith letting you reuse them, But guess what? Not only is Chaos Control arguably the best deck to do this in GOAT, but one of the best decks at dealing with control decks is Chaos Turbo, which can also run Faith. So again, an aspect of this card that should work against the best deck actually helps it out even more. God, Chaos, why are you so broken? I'm going to be honest, I don't know with this one. On one hand, yes, this is one of the most powerful cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And yes, nowadays there's no question this card is too strong to see play, with the game now basically making the graveyard your second hand. It also does make Chaos and decks that can splash BLS extra powerful, by both helping find the boogeyman of the format and help to play him. But on the other hand, it also helps rogue decks dig for staples or their own answers to the meta, and in the case of cards like Gigantes and decks like Zombies with Book of Life, it can directly fuel anti-meta strategies as much as Chaos. Then again, this card is also really swingy and can put one player really far ahead, but then again, unlike Duo, as the opponent is in down resources and the player user hasn't gained any extra card advantage, it's not as powerful as Duo in that regard. I know I'm all over the place with this one, but the truth is, Graze was one of the best cards ever made in a format where it can't do anything that broken. It was banned due to being a one-card chaos machine at the time, but the cards that were required to be banned permanently were a couple of sets away. So I guess my final vote on this card is that there's ample reason to ban it, but I think with the power level of post-Yatta Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's fine at 1. But I'd like to hear from the community on this one. Would GOAT be better without Graceful, or does Graceful make the format much better? Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts on this card are. Thank you. So in the last list we saw the bannings of the game's two best board wipes with the removal of Dark Hole and Regeki, and around the same time in Flames of Destruction we got the release of Lightning Vortex, a very powered down version of Regeki. Coincidence? I think not! A normal spell, this card lets us discard a card and destroy all face up monsters on the opponent's side of the field. So right out of the gate, this card is highly powered down compared to Regeki, as it only hits face-up monsters, and with the discard cost, it was actually somewhat of a risk to play this card, unlike its broken father, as if it gets negated, not only are we down a spell, but another card due to this discard cost. This is a good thing, by the way, as back when this card came out, Graveyard Recursion was far worse than it would be even a few years later, and other than Sangan, there weren't many good effects that triggered on non-battle destruction either, so yeah, up in the board in GOAT, kind of OP, and well in need of a downside. Not that one discard much of a downside in a format where Thunder Dragon reigns supreme, Potter Grid is legal, Magician of Faith is recycling the cards you discarded, or Vortex itself, but I digress. Also, yes, you had Chaos monsters that could make use of a full yard, but you'd better pray you have that BLS or Chaos Sock ready to go at that moment, because chances are you wouldn't last long against your opponent's board if they use this offensively. Also, on that note, if you played an aggro deck, this card was one of the best weapons control decks had against you when behind, as they could almost certainly be able to use their recruiters, recursion effects and card draw to bury your aggro deck in card advantage once your field was wiped. In fact, with its ability to face down cards, this card may be one of Control's best weapons in the war versus aggro. So to sum it up, Lightning Vortex is a powerful, it definitely told them replacement for Regeki and Dark Hole that a reasonable restriction and cost. With that being said, as I'll explain now, yes, it needed to be at 1. Yes, this card is a powered down version of most powerful cards like Regeki and Dark Hole, but it's still a one card field clearer in a format that, especially in its original form, is built on resource management and 1-for-1 interactions. So having a card that can be at best a 1-for-5, and usually a card that can take out multiple threats anyway, it's really not a good card to have in this kind of format at more than 1. In addition to this, why this card have to go to 1 in my eyes is the fact that it does the worst thing a card can do. It narrows down the amount of viable decks. Yes, at 1, this card simply makes control and aggro equals, with control getting more out of this card as it can use wipe aggro's entire field, whereas aggro can use this card along with cards like Mystic Sword on level 2 to clear the control player's field. When this card's at 3 though, the scales are tipped so massively in favour of control it's not even funny. Firstly, Control can rebuild their board far quicker when wiped, due to 1, having more monsters they want to set, meaning this card can't hit them, 2, they've got ways to draw cards, and Recursion, Clean Magician of Faith, which gives Control even more use to this card, And finally, unlike aggro, which has to sacrifice a card to discard whenever they want to use this effect, control decks often usually got access to both Sinister Serpent and, if they're playing Chaos, Thunder Dragon, making the cost of this card essentially null and void. Add on to that the discarding for this card can often be used as fodder for BLS, Chaos Sorcerer and other Chaos cards, and this card at more than one would have made GOAT even more of a 2-deck format than it already was back in the day, as I don't think anything outside of GOAT, Control and Chaos would be able to do well. So in summary, this card is a great balanced version of an, at the time, way overpowered card, but it being a board wipe made it inherently powerful regardless of the restrictions placed on it. So yeah, it being at 1 is completely justified, and another good move for the GOAT format ban list. Oh, you mean a card that only grants a big attack boost if you play Scapegoat? Wasn't a card we need to ban when Ring of Destruction, Sekretsu Armor and Mirror Force are all staples? Who could have seen that coming? I covered this card at length in the first ban list video, but it bears repeating that the only deck this card has ever been used in, competitively, is BenKOTK, a fringe at best deck in original GOAT format, and one that has gotten substantially worse in modern GOAT, with the rise of non-battle removal traps like Wing Blast and Regeki Break, killing the card before you can even equip him. Now, based on lists I've seen, despite Scapegoat being very popular at the time in both Chaos and GOAT control decks, this card never really saw any play in either deck, but them both playing 3 Scapegoat, and it's not really hard to see why, as in any deck that's not built to OTK, this card is the definition of win more. Oh, your BLS is 7k now, alright, Chain Regeki Break. The reason this card works in BenKOTK is that the deck can run Giant Trunade and Heavy Storm, make it better removal before activating this card, or just destroy it or bounce it if done before Benke hit the field. But outside of OTKs that play a ton of back row hate, this card just screams 2 for 1 me, and not to mention, 1, without playing Scapegoat, this card isn't worth playing as GOAT isn't exactly a format known for spamming the field with a bunch of monsters, and 2, even if some of you managed to get a full board without GOATs, all you're doing there is leaving yourself wide open for another card we'll talk about later on in this list. This card should never have been banned, however it should also not be at more than 1 either at this time. Yes, the chances of a deck playing Scapegoat one-shotting you with this card is low, but not impossible, and with Scapegoat seeing playing a lot of control decks at the time, this card really couldn't have been more than 1, because the balancing downside for control decks at this point was that they were slower than aggro, but made up for it with their long grind game, and this card just makes it so there's no point playing a non-Scapegoat deck, because you can both grind them out and possibly win early. Now I can't guarantee that GOAT-focused decks like GOAT Control and Chaos Control would have played this card for the reasons I've listed above, but I'd rather not find out either. So personally I think 1 is a good spot for this card at the time, as when the deck that focuses on equips in BenK could still run it, but a deck like GOAT Control couldn't really justify playing the 1 of in their lists. First of all, let me just say, if you play this in Edison format, 1, I hate you, and 2, stop killing my frogs. Yeah, this card is pretty much the reason why Frog Monarch is not really a thing in Edison anymore, now requiring at least a hero engine to be playable, and why a lot of Edison Frog decks now just aim to be quick combo decks to avoid this card, usually using cards like Fishbowl Blaster. In GOAT, however, this card, while still strong, is a lot less format warping, as its activation condition is a lot harder to achieve. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. What does this card do exactly? Well, to put it simply, this card is an inverted crush card virus, requiring a big monster to be sacrificed to kill all the opponent's small ones. More specifically, it requires a sacrifice of a dark monster with 2,000 or more attack points, and in exchange, it destroys all monsters in the opponent's hand, field, and that they draw for the next 3 turns if they've got 1,500 or less attack points. Damn, monsters in Yugioh with exactly 1,500 are catching more viruses than anti-vaxxers kids, it looks like. Like I said in Edison, this card is nuts, thanks to having a lot of easy to summon big dark targets, like Caius the Shadow Monarch, Dark Arm Dragon, and of course the Dark Synchro monsters. In GOAT, however, this card is much harder to activate, with the easiest targets being Zombie of the Dark, Giant Orc, Gravekeeper's Spy with Necro Valley, and Dark Elf, which some aggro decks have started playing, by the way. Other targets include Chaos Sork and Demork. But the problem is that Chaos Sork is a monster you'd never want to use, as they're much better on the field, and Demork's only used in combo decks that never play this card. This pretty much limits this card to only be usable in aggressive decks that either play bad high attack monsters like Zombira, or decks like Gravekeeper that can easily buff their dark monsters. So I guess if Lightning Vortex is one of Control's best limited cards, this is one of Aggro's, which is weird because you'd think the trap would be better off in slower decks, but there we are. So this card limit like Vortex is justified, right? Kind of, I suppose. This is another card whose limiting I'm kind of unsure about. On one hand, yes, this card can in some conditions end a control player's night fairly quickly, and yes, it gives perfect hand knowledge. However, unlike Lightning Vortex in Control, this card's got a very specific activation condition that many decks will find hard to activate, and even the ones that can use this card quite well often won't, because as mentioned before, aggro decks can't afford to lose too many resources as they're not as good in the grind game, and they'd rather just put those big monsters on the board and attack the opponent directly after using their 1-for-1 removal. However, I'm still leaning towards this card limit being fine, as this card in some conditions can just end a player's night, and we don't want too many of those kind of cards in the game. However, I want to just add this card's banning was likely a knee-jerk reaction to Crush Card Virus being recently banned in the OCG, with people thinking, oh well, it's a virus card, it must be really powerful, right? I mean, yes, this card is good, but it's nowhere near old, unerrated Crush Card good. So my final conclusion is, limit was probably justified, with the caveat it was probably done more as a knee-jerk reaction to Crush Card Virus's banning than anything else. And to cap off the limited portion of this list, we have one of the strongest cards taken off the original ban list. It's Mirror Force. A reactive board wipe, like I explained last time, this card triggers on its controller being attacked and destroys opposition monsters the attacker controls. Now this seems mega overpowered for this point in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Well actually, yeah, it kind of is. I've already shown how powerful board wipes are in GOAT format, and this one, while far less flexible in use than the likes of Lightning Vortex, can also end the opponent's battle phase, and unlike Vortex, it has no cost to activate. In addition to this, while less likely, it can also be recurred by Mask of Darkness, like Vortex can with Faith, so this is adding more field wipes to a format that has tried its best to limit the amount possible because of how overpowered they are at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! And finally, it also can cause games to go for a really long time, as many players try and circumvent a full board wipe by this card by playing for some monsters in defense position when they want to attack. Thus, even when they've got lethal lines, they sometimes won't go for it out of fear of this card, which can make games drag on way longer than they need to. Wow, this card being unbanned sounds like a really bad idea, right? Well, about that. Mirror Force is the boogeyman of GOAT in a lot of ways, and yes, it can quickly end a game, and it's the ultimate feel-bad card when you get wiped out by it. But I would never want to play GOAT without it. Why? Because this card forces you to be a better player whether you're playing against it or with it. Going against a Mirror Force will teach new GOAT players many important lessons. Firstly, it helps break a bad habit from modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Of always attacking with everything onto a clear field. Most players now have never had to worry about battle traps, as they've been terrible for about 10 years now, but if Magic, Cylinder and Sakura Sama don't teach you to respect them in this format, this card definitely will. Secondly, it really forces players to evaluate how good their cards are at any given moment. Like I said before, this card forces players to put cards too valuable to lose in defense position before attacking, so Force essentially makes you constantly evaluate which monsters you want to attack with, and which ones you want to save behind for their effects or for defense. If you're the one playing the Mirror Force, the lessons you will learn will be twofold. Firstly, and most obviously, you'll learn about the best time to activate certain cards. You see, because this card is a board wipe, you may be tempted to hold it until you can get a massive blowout, a 2-for-1, 3-for-1 or even more. However, this isn't always the best way to play this card, as sometimes hitting a critical target like BLS can be more useful. On the flip side, sometimes it may be better to hold off Mirror Force on a strong target to try and bait the opponents to overcommit when they think you haven't gotten it. You see, Mirror Force is a card that is both highly respected and feared in old Yu-Gi-Oh! As it has all the blow-up power of the other board wipes, but as it can only be done in response to an opponent's actions, it makes players behave in a certain way to avoid the brunt force of the damage it can do, as I've shown above. So sometimes just setting a back row when they know you still have Mirror Force in rotation can make your opponent play suboptimally. And no, this is not illegal by the way, because you aren't actually bluffing with this, because you're still selling one card with no indication of what it is. So in conclusion, while it has no business being any more than 1, as one of GOAT's strongest cards, this card improves player skills so much I can never justify banning it. And finally move on to the most controversial part of the Unlimited list, the semi-limited section. Often considered the rarest stepchild of Yu-Gi-Oh's banned list, the semi-limited section has often proven to be nothing more than a holding ground for forming limited cards that are no longer relevant to be tested out before they're putting them back to 3 on the next list. Oh, and I guess Malicious is also there as the doorman, I suppose. Now, for the most part, yes, I would agree with this assessment, particularly in more recent years, where the majority of cards that go to 2 are put to 3 on the very next list. However, I would argue that especially in the earlier days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this list did have a purpose of reducing the consistency of combos that acquired multiples of the same card, which yes, nowadays where every deck can search its combo pieces isn't relevant, but back then, when that was less likely, it actually made combos less consistent, bringing down the power level of certain decks. So this is my point. Rather than start with alphabetically this time, let's begin this list by showing a card that shows what I'm talking about. A flip monster, Night Assailant was not only a minor bug on the field, in that it flipped to destroy a monster, but it also had an effect in the hand that used to say, when this card is sent to the graveyard, add a flip monster back to your hand. Yeah, notice how the words other than Night Assailant weren't originally on this card, and I think you can see the problem here. Yeah, by having multiple copies of this card, one in hand and one in the yard, you essentially had an infinite amount of discard fodder, and by sending one to the graveyard, you could then bring the other one back, creating a loop of essentially infinite discarding, which when combined with a non-once per turn effect involving discarding, either for cost or part of the effect, can get pretty nutty. The most prominent use of this loop in GOAT format was of course Tribe Infecting Virus. Now Tribe was one of the few ways GOAT players have of wiping the board in the format, but the problem was that sometimes it came at a very high cost, because Tribe requires a discard for every type of monster you want to destroy. However, when combined with this loop, you essentially have your own build or Regeki card, in a format deemed too weak for most straight up board wipes. Outside of this, the loop also helps duo-proof your hand, and trust me, nothing feels better than getting duoed than to hit Sinister Serpent, and then you discard this card as well. It also makes discard traps like Wing Blast and Regeki Break essentially free, and makes card destruction a lot weaker. Now, while this combo is good, it also isn't that broken, as it costs a minimum of 3 cards to use most of the time, so there's no need to put Assailants to 1, completely killing the combo. And this is where the semi-limited list shines. Honestly, putting this card to 2 was the perfect way of dealing with it. With it being at 2, the combo is still possible, however with less copies of this card, a player wishing to do this combo would either have to be lucky to hard draw both copies of Night Assailant, or have to use a recruiter like Sangar or Mystic Tomato to search one or both, which limits the deck on searching other valuable targets in exchange for a field wipe. So yeah, funnily enough, we do have a card that kind of justifies the semi-limited list here. Not that this means most of the cards on this will do the same thing. Speaking of which... Here we have the perfect example of why most players hate the semi-limited list. A level 4 water Abyss Soldier lets you pitch a water from your hand and bounce a card to its owner's hand, an effect that was a soft once per turn, which is the only reason I can think of this card was put to 2, other than to screw up budget players slightly, as not only was this card easy to get video game promo, making one of the most affordable pieces of removal at the time, but also a great budget upgrade to what may consider to be the best destructive deck at the time, Fury from the Deep. So it's kind of obvious why Konami were thinking here. This card with Sinister Serpent is a free bounce each turn, and in a water-focused deck, multiples of this card could clear a field at the cost of most of your hand. So the likely didn't want 3 of these and a salvage or 2 plus Serpent wiping fields turn after turn. Because they're like, what's this going to do that another way on anything? Tribe Infecting Virus! However, let's be honest here, even at 2, this is still very possible, as all you've done is make the card slightly less consistent to draw, which the combo still is intact. Add on to this, while this card is technically splashable due to how many decks run Serpent, there are many times in non-water decks where all this card is a decent beater that can't even get over Spy, and it makes you wonder why they bothered touching this card at all. No, it did not. Let's be honest here, this card being a 2 barely makes a difference, other than its lack of searchability means you'll draw it less often now. It barely saw play anywhere outside of water decks where it could be used every turn, and even aggro decks that do splashes seem perfectly fine running it at 2, and playing a warrior package for more removal as well. So while Knight Assailant show what the semi-limited list can occasionally make a difference, this card shows why most of the time it doesn't really matter in the slightest. Okay, so we have one card that has a reason to be semi-limited, and a card that showcases why for the most part the semi-limited list is as useful as YouTube support systems. We've got a card smack dab in the middle of this, as to be honest, semi-limiting Vampire Lord did nothing to affect its deck's playability, however it did slightly affect how the deck was built. A 1 tribute zombie, Lord was often one of the strongest cards in pure zombie decks, and saw a lot of play in other dark focus decks as well at the time. This is because, like Sacred Fates of Nethys, this card can also bring itself back from the graveyard if it's destroyed by card effect on the next turn. Now yes, it doesn't heavy storm in the field, but it makes up for this by 1, being a 1 tribute monster meaning he's a lot easier to summon, and 2, having the bleed effect that most vampire cards have, which means anytime this card does battle damage to the opponent, it also forces the player to send any card of a type of your choice, monster, spell or trap, to the graveyard. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would I want to give my opponent free Foolish Burials and Foolish Burial goods? And yes, nowadays this effect is one of the worst you could put on a Yu-Gi-Oh card, but back in the day graveyard effects were far less common than now, with no matter spells or traps doing much of anything in the yard. Yes, chaos made sending opponents monsters a massive risk, but there wasn't much of a downside of making an opponent send back rows to the yard, especially trap cards, as 1, Mask of Darkness is far less played compared to Magician of Faith, and 2, with only staple traps being played in most goat decks, you're almost guaranteed to get a good hit off of it. Sure, you may occasionally get a late game trap to shoot, but usually you'll get a good trap like Call of the Haunted, or even Mirror Force if the game goes long enough for them to exhaust the small trap supply most decks have. Now yes, this card being a 2 changes literally nothing when it comes to zombie decks, but with zombie being a very popular deck for players getting into competitive due to zombie madness, it did serve a small but notable purpose. Okay, wow, this list is so good it actually has 2 semi-limits I agree with. True, this one doesn't do what reducing a card's legal number is supposed to do, aka reduce the deck's power level, but at least the semi-limit forces players to play the right amount of Vampire Lords in their zombie decks alongside 1 Ryo Koki, making it easier for new comp players to do better with the builds of their decks. A stretch I know, but it's more than most semi-limits do. Speaking of which... And now we're getting to the what is the even point of this section of the list. Why is Check the Yellow here? This card was useless. All it does is allow you to bounce 1 card or potentially Fate Seal your opponent's deck, and it needs to inflict battle damage to your opponent to even do these mediocre effects, which given this card's very low stats was not very likely. But Abyss, didn't you just say this card had an OTK? Yes it did, and I also said that MacLeod was banned, making this card about as useful as most of LOB. No, obviously not. Without MacLeod, the most this card could do would be to bounce back a Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial, or some Floodgates, if they became detrimental to you, although the former could be done better with Giant Trunade, and that would rarely come up as most decks that played Floodgates like Royal Decree at the time played no other traps, for example. This may be the dumbest change in a Banlist history, and the fact that it was changed back to 3 on the very next list, and never saw play again speaks volumes to how much this card did need to go to 2. Also, even if it mattered, we've got 3 Tomatoes, 2 Rotors, and a Sanguine Goat, so it wouldn't make a difference anyway. Another great example of the semi-limited list being utterly useless, we next have Emergency Provisions. A quick play spell, this card lets us destroy any other back row we control, and in exchange gain 1000 points per card. Now a large life point boost is nothing to sneeze at this time, but this card never saw play for that reason alone. No, the main purpose of this card was to pop continuous cards that you didn't want on your field anymore, the most common of which of course was Mirage of Nightmare. The idea being you would refill your hand to 4 during the opponent's turn before popping the card on your own turn before discarding anything. But like Chick, Why was this card even touched when the card it combined with was banned on the same list? Now, unlike Chick, this card did have fringe uses even when its combo partner was put to 0, such as removing your own floodgates like Kaiser Coliseum, Gravity Bind, and Unlimited Area B, or just getting you life points in Time or versus Burn. But again, it's been put to 2, so who cares? You're going to see it a lot of the time if you play it anyway. Wow, this is incredible. We've got another good semi-limit. It's Upstart Goblin. A normal spell, this card is one of the simplest cards on this list. You draw a card and your opponent gets 1,000 life points. That's it. So essentially, this card simply lets you cheat the Yu-Gi-Oh's deck size minimum limit, as any copies of this card can essentially be cashed in for another card, which alongside the @3 Jar of Greed means several decks could play essentially 35 cards, making them much more consistent and much less prone to variance, thus making luck a far less important element in this game. Now this is great for decks that play normally, but when using FTK decks, this card essentially makes them bricking far less likely. Also, don't worry about the 1,000 life points thing. If you're playing an FTK, it doesn't even matter, as you're probably win with Exodia. And if you're playing a non-FTK deck, 1,000 life points doesn't really matter in a grindy format like GOAT. Now I'm glad this card wasn't put to 1, as in fair decks this card and Jar of Greed have helped make the decks less luck based and more interesting. But in FTKs this card easily turns into a pot of greed thanks to Royal Magical Library, making FTKs even more of a pain in the ass than they already are in GOAT. Yes, this similar doesn't do much to stop this, but if even one library player fails their combo due to not drawing one more draw card, it's worth it. Okay, this time we've got 2 cards to talk about, in Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B. 2 cards whose purpose is to prevent attacks from big monsters, with Gravity Bind stopping level 4s from attacking, and Level Limit Area B forcing them into defense position. Now these cards saw play in a few decks that didn't win by battling, like Pac-Man, but they were most known for their use in burn decks. With most of them only playing small monsters that did need to attack, Burn used these cards alongside Messenger of Peace to lock down the opponent's board, essentially preventing them from attacking them while they slowly burned them away. In addition to this, as more burn decks played cards like Gagageri Panda, they used these cards to basically set the monsters up to be run over by the panda once they got big enough. Basically, these 2 cards make the game not very fun to play, as you're basically sitting there watching your opponent kill you. This was even worse in non-burn decks like the aforementioned Pac-Man, and most importantly Final Countdown. Essentially all you were doing there was literally watching as your opponents span their wheels for about 10 or 15 turns before you eventually conceded out of boredom. However, selecting these cards to me seems very weird, and I'll explain why now. Again, I've got to ask, what was the point of this semi-limit? All this does is force burn decks to play 3 Messenger of Peace, meaning the amount of floodgates the deck runs hasn't actually changed in Lockdown Burn, and as other burn decks play fewer floodgates these days anyway, due to the more aggressive strategy with the panda, this doesn't to them either. Yes, this has an effect on decks like Final Countdown and other stall strats, but I don't think we should be focusing on barely playable fringe decks when limiting cards, no matter how annoying they are. And we finish this list off with one final good semi-limit in Good Goblin Housekeeping. A normal trap, this card, like Upstart Goblin, draws you a card on activation replacing itself. However, in addition to this, it draws you an additional card for every copy of the card in your graveyard. So basically, if you've got 3 of these in your deck, the first one's an Upstart, second one's a Pot of Greed, and the third one's a Graceful Charity minus the discard. Yeah, I think we can see how this card's put to 2, right? Okay, to be honest, this card didn't need to go to 2 either. When MacLeod was banned, this card's use in FTK decks no longer applied, as you couldn't play it the turn you drew it. And basically the only decks that would run this card would be decks that wanted a bit more draw power at the cost of consistency. However, I'm glad this came into 2, because just on principle, a Graceful Charity without a discard shouldn't exist in any format. Yes, an extra Pot of Greed is pretty powerful, but you're playing 2 bricks together, so I think that's fairly fair. So, amazing bands, decent limits, and even an okay semi-limited list. This may be the best list of all time, but we've got one more card to talk about, a card that went to 3. Can the GOAT format ban list take the landing? Let's find out. And finally we end this video by looking at the one card that was deemed weak enough that it could be safely moved all the way back to 3 copies. And I wish I could end this video on a positive note, but I can't, because I genuinely hate Morphing Jar 2. However, before getting into why I hate this card, let's get this out of the way. No, this card isn't good in GOAT, but that still doesn't mean I like the idea of more of it in the format, because this card is just plain annoying. When this card is flipped, like Cyberjar, you clear the field, in this case shuffling monsters back into the deck. Then both players flip the top card of their deck and summon any monster they get until they have the same number of face and defense position monsters as the monster they lost in the effect. So again, kind of like Cyberjar, but one problem, they're all face down, so you aren't getting anywhere and you didn't draw any cards because the cards you didn't summon get put back into the deck. So yeah, in case you can't tell, all this card really does is stall for time. Yes, as much as I personally can't stand this card, it absolutely does nothing in GOAT format and can be at 3 safely, especially when there are other jars that do much more in the format legally. However, the fact this card does nothing is why I hate it so much, because when a player flips this, they aren't really getting any advantage, because you've got the same number of monsters in the field before and after it's flipped, and you've got anything new in your hand either, so if you're already behind, this isn't helping you there either. Basically, all this card and card like Nimble Monga do is drag the game out far too long. So for that reason, I'm glad this card, even though it's at 3, sees no play in GOAT. So in conclusion, wow, this is a really good ban list. In my opinion, this is what every ban list should be, in that it removes elements from the game that make it unfun and non-interactive, while either not touching actual fun decks, or just giving them a bit of a rap on the knuckles, like with DD Warrior Lady's Limit. As we've seen, GOAT has become one of the best formats in Yu-Gi-Oh! And while Edison has eclipsed it as the best retro format, players like me still to go back to the old times playing this absolutely amazing format, and it's all thanks to this list. Not that this list is perfect though, as for some reason both Giant Druid and Last Will remains at 3 on it, which as we've seen in modern GOAT is a massive issue, as it leads to both Stein and Cat combo decks becoming tiered threats, which can't defeat the purpose of GOAT being this slow, grindy format we all like. However, those are small nitpicks on a great list. Thank you all for watching, and join me next time when we look at the list that ended GOAT format.